Let's start making the terrain, where the characters can walk and jump. Here's where we're gonna start creating the assets by finally using proper tiles. Not just using the grids for measuring the sizes, but actually using them to guide us in the process of creating repeating tileable patterns. But first, I want to show you that you can apply everything we'll see to tiled and non-tiled assets by equal. So before making the actual tiled assets, I want to start by creating this non-tiled floating platform that's very common in most 2D platformers. And on the way, show you the approach and techniques to create terrain that we'll be reusing when we make the actual terrain tile. This floating platform will be very similar to the actual tile assets. It's gonna use similar graphics and patterns. After all, it's gonna go in the same composition, but with the main difference that we'll have a bit more freedom. Since we are not constrained to a single grid square, and we can focus more on the techniques and methods to creating terrain in general. But before start drawing, let's take a look at how other platformer games create this type of platform and terrain in general. So take a look at these screenshots of these 8 and 16-bit games. I know these games are not illustrated using vectors, but we can study and take inspiration from the design of the assets. Look at how the terrain, including the platforms, are usually separated in two. You have the top, usually with a nice green grass layer, and then you have the actual terrain below. Also notice how the grass grows, not only on the top, but also hangs a bit to the side, as if it was a real cross-section of a terrain with grass on top. This pattern is very common, not only for terrains with grass, but also pretty much any terrain. You'll see snow hanging to the side in the snowy terrains, or leaves in a jungle, or even rocks on a desert. This makes the graphics much more illustrative and therefore more appealing. Finally, a common pattern that you'll see in a lot of games, no matter the type, is to simplify the terrain texture with these wavy colorations. No matter the style, you'll see that creating these waves is a really efficient way to make an area give the illusion of being a cross-section of an actual terrain. And if you add a few varied things in there like rocks or bones, then the illusion will be even bigger. We are gonna design our terrain using these observations, so keep them in mind. We are not gonna use the grid to create the tiles, but we are still using it to guide ourselves for the sizes. In this platform will be about 3 tiles by 1.5 grid squares. So let us start with the grass. I want to show you a nice and easy way to build grass or any other organic shape using the Boolean union technique we saw in the techniques lesson. First, to guide yourself better, create a rectangle of 3 tiles wide and less than half a tile high. Now, using the ellipse tool, do like we did in the union techniques lesson and add a lot of ellipses overlapping. What you want here is to vary the sizes of the ellipses to create an interesting looking silhouette, avoiding creating more than 2 consecutive ellipses of the same size or width. So if you need, don't be afraid of grabbing the object tool and moving them around to get the best looking silhouette. Pay special attention to the edges. You want a nice protrusion of grass that leaves the 3 squares limit of the platform. When you're done, join everything with a union and give it this bright green color. Copy my colors if you want. Now, very important, we want a nice organic looking silhouette, and for that we're gonna need to make a couple of adjustments to the path. So go in and delete all nodes that are in the bumps. Basically delete everything that's not a corner node. Now that we have only nodes in the corners, we can easily grab the bumps with the node tool and move and drag each of them, so they look more like grass. What you want is to give it a bit of weight, like the mass of grass is falling because of gravity. Also, don't be afraid of moving the actual corner nodes to better adjust the silhouette so it looks nicer. Remember, the key here is variation. You want the grass to be more or less the height of a half a tile, but variate a lot the sizes of each mass. Now for the platform itself. Since this is a floating platform, I want to give it a nice interesting silhouette. So grab the pen tool and creating straight lines, make this uneven terrain shape. I want to make it about one tile high. When you're done, give it this orangey brown color. Okay, we're done with the form. Now let's give it the details. Let's start with the grass. First I want a highlight on top to emphasize a bit the walkable area. This is easy. Just use the pen tool to create a perfectly straight line on top and intersect it inside. Give it a highlight color, but make it subtle. This highlight is meant to imply that this area is walkable, but you don't want it to be distracting either. Okay, now I want to make the grass a bit more interesting. For that, let's give it a shadow area down below. The easiest way to do that is to use the difference technique. You know the drill? Duplicate 2 times, change color and perform a difference. You want a nice and thick shadow area. When you're done, give it a shadow color. If you're feeling unsatisfied with the shape, you can always go in and adjust the path a bit with the node tool. Speaking of shadows, let's add a nice drop shadow in the terrain. This one is gonna be easy. Just duplicate the shape of the grass, send it below, and move it a bit down. As far as the color, we don't know what's gonna be below, so in this case, just give it a low opacity black shadow. And of course, intersect it inside the terrain area so it won't show outside. Great, one final step. With this grass shape, we want to give it a nice outline, just like with all the other assets. So you know what to do. Duplicate the main shape, send it below the other grass shapes, give it a nice and thick stroke width, and of course give it a darker shade of the same green. And we're done with the grass area for now. I recommend you to zoom out and see how it looks from far away. Now for the details in the terrain. Here we're gonna make a couple of more complex stuff. Don't worry, it won't be anything too difficult. What I want to do is to show you a few of the many ways in which you can add detail to a terrain. For this floating platform I want to create a bit of damage, like an eroded part. This is easy to make. Grab the pen tool and make this line with multiple planes. Intersect it in on the lower side, and change the color to make it a bit darker than the other terrain. To emphasize the change in plane, let's add another plane right below. This one is easy. Use the difference technique. Make this new plane thinner, and again make it a bit darker. I want to make this new plane more interesting, so let's add some detail. Grab the pen tool and add 2 or more of these spikes or planes. They are supposed to be damaged just like the damage in the block or the crate. I feel this whole floating platform feels a bit plain. To help with this, I want to define a few planes in the border all around it. So with the pen tool, create a shape following more or less the silhouette of the terrain, and when you're done, intersect it inside. Now give it a low opacity black shadow like we've done so many times before, but this time I don't want us to leave it full black. It removes a bit of the color. The shadow in particular should be a bit warmer, so instead of leaving it like this, move the saturation slider all the way up and give the shadow a really dark, almost black brown. And of course adjust the alpha. You should notice that the color of the brown tints the shadow a bit, make it less dull. A fully black, low opacity shadow not only takes lightness from a color, but also takes saturation, so keep that in mind. Now to give it some nice detail. Do the same you did with the plane on top, create multiple shapes of damage, and join them with the shape using a union. I will repeat what I said originally in the block lesson. You don't want to oversaturate it with tons of these small details. Just add a few here and there where it feels empty. Okay, for the next step it will be really useful to enable snapping. Once you enable snapping, make sure that all the default options are on. I'm telling you in case that you leave the snapping to corners off from when we made the other assets. Now here comes the cool part. With the pen tool, create a shape that snaps to all 4 nodes to create a plane. Also don't forget to also snap to the damage detail if you need to. What we want is to give all planes that point to the right a darker tone to imply that the light is hitting those planes less. So you only need to create these shapes in the planes pointing to the right. As far as color, you can give it the same color than the shape below, maybe a bit darker, and you'll see that because of the transparency, the colors will multiply and you'll get the darker tone you want. Now for a couple of extra details to close up everything. With the pen tool, create a couple of these polygons on the top part. These are supposed to be carved planes resulting from damage, so give them the same color as the other plane below. And here's a tiny little detail that I like to add to all terrain. A few small rocks on the lower darker plane. These are super easy to do. With the pen tool, just draw a few 4 or 5 side planes polygons. Make them really small. They're not supposed to call attention to themselves. They're just a nice little detail. So give them a grey color that won't contrast too much with the color of the brown in the back. and we are done with the floating platform. We're gonna be reusing some of the things you've seen here to create the tileable terrain. So make sure to get everything in this lesson before taking the next one. Okay, let's finally start with the tiles. But before we begin drawing anything, I want to talk about what we need to approach the creation of our tiles. Because we want to be able to build not only the floors, but also platforms, we'll need to have a minimum of 4 different terrain tiles, so a platform looks good and complete. One tile for the top, the one that has the grass, another tile for the middle without grass, and at least 2 more tiles for the sides. These are the most common tiles you need for a simple platform, but this is if you're not counting other types of terrain like inclined terrains or any other special type. Now what we're gonna do to save up some time is to draw a single terrain patch that we're gonna reuse for the grass terrain tile on top and for the pure terrain tile on the bottom. In real life there is not that much benefit from doing this, but in this course, first I want to save up some time, and second, I think that it's kinda neat to be able to do these things using vectors. Anyway, let's get started. A quick thought. Just because the grid will represent a single tile in the game, it doesn't mean that we are forced to make each tile of a single unit. Remember, we are working with tiles for the convenience of using repeatable assets for the terrain, not because of any technical limitation. So these tiles we're gonna make are gonna occupy 4 grid squares in the final illustration. I believe that it looks better this way and we can create a bit more detailed terrain tiles without losing detail because it looks too small. Here I've imported the floating platform we made in the previous lesson. We're gonna take inspiration as well as sample the colors so we don't have to worry about anything but building the asset. So let's start. Grab the rectangle tool and with the snapping enabled, make a rectangle of 2 tiles by 2. And give it the same color as the main terrain color of the platform, this brown-orange. Now we are gonna follow the same procedure than before to create the grass on top. But now we have a couple of extra things to think about, and that is that the grass needs to wrap back so it can tile. But one thing at a time. First grab the rectangle tool and make a rectangle of about half of a half tile. Repeat the same steps as before, add a few ellipses, and make sure that they all look uneven and organic. Also, to make the things easier for the next step, make sure that there is one similar size ellipse in the corners of both ends of the tile, being cut off at half point more or less. And this will simplify hugely the work for us. When we are done, join them all with a union, and of course intersect them inside the tile. Here comes the part where you make these bumps nicer and more organic with the node tool. Remove the unnecessary nodes so it's easier to grab them and adjust the bumps. Don't forget making them feel like they are being pulled by gravity. Now, if you followed my advice and place an ellipse in the middle of each end, this next step should be easy. Grab the 2 end nodes and open the Align and Distribute dialog. Go to Object, Align and Distribute. Now go to the Path section and click on this button. This will align both nodes at exactly the same vertical position. I think you know what you should do now. Make sure snapping is enabled and duplicate the 2 shapes to the side. And with the shape at the side, fix and adjust the original version so it gives a smooth transition between the two tiles. And repeat the same step with the other side. Great, we are done with the grass shape. But here I want to do something slightly different than what we did with the non-tileable platform. I want to do something that's pretty common for the graphics in these types of games, and that is to create a second layer of grass that's a bit darker and makes the tile a lot more interesting. So we are gonna repeat the exact same process than before, but just below the other grass. But the cool thing about vector illustration is that there is always a way to cheat, and here you can cheat a bit and save a lot of time. Let me show you how. This is easy. Duplicate the grass shape and snap it to the side so there are two grass shapes continuously. Since you adjust them so they should match perfectly. Duplicate these two shapes and join them into a single one with a union. Now move it below the other grass shape and down a bit. This is gonna be the second grass shape, and it should be a darker shade of the same green. Now here comes the cool part. Now you can slide it to the left or right, and you'll know for sure that it's gonna tile perfectly, since they are two tile shapes joined together. Here I also recommend you to flip it horizontally with the H key, so you get the extra variation. Once you place it and it looks sufficiently different than the other grass shape above, you should intersect it inside the tile. And if you want, you can make some final adjustments, like moving the nodes or making some minor transformations. And that's it for the shapes of the grass. Now let's do the same we did with the other grass shape, and give it some color and outline. First the highlight on top. Just draw a quick highlight on the upper part with the pen tool, and intersect it in. If you hold the control to make a straight line, obviously it will tile perfectly. Now sample the highlight color from the platform we made last lesson. For the shadows below, you know the drill. Using the difference technique, create a shadow shape on the lower part, and give it a shadow color. And repeat the same steps with the darker grass shape below. Now very quickly the drop shadows for the two grass shapes. And now for the outline, we want two outlines, one on the top grass shape and another for the bottom one. The only difference with the outline of the floating platform is that now we are gonna have to delete the sides so they tile as well. So once you select the right color thickness and position, select the outline shape, select both nodes at the sides with the node tool, and click on this button. This button removes the stroke between two or more selected nodes, which in this case is exactly what we want. Do the same with the two outlines on the left and right side. Now the grass and its outline is ready to tile perfectly. It may happen that after you remove the side of an outline, a bit of the outline leaves the tile square. This is because of the way the outline is rotated. To fix this, there is no other way than to transform this outline to a path and intersect it inside using a rectangle the size of a tile. So make sure to give it the final shape and size you want before transforming it to a path, because once you do it, it'll be impossible to adjust anything. Okay, now that we are done with the grass, let's make the actual terrain area. So let's start with our wave pattern. And remember, this pattern is gonna have to be usable for both the tile with the grass on top and the tile that's only terrain. So what I've come up with is to hide one of the waves below the two patches of grass. So the upper tile looks different, but it's the same design than the middle one. Duplicate the main tile to the side. To create the waves, we are gonna use the pen tool. So grab the pen tool and draw these wavy shapes. Don't worry about making them round, we're gonna round them in a second. Just worry about making them thick enough, and that they are in the right position. Remember, we want to hide one of them below the grass. So once you intersect them inside, you may want to move them up or down, or even scale them if you don't like the way they look. But make sure to leave one of them completely hidden by the grass shape. That's the reason why I wanted to duplicate the tile to the side, so we can see better where the grass was gonna be. Now it's time to give it some color. What you want to do is to give it a darker or lighter version of the orange we are using. Use the L slider along with the S slider to handle the lightness, but also the saturation on each of these waves. You may also want to play around a bit with the H slider to give it a bit of a different tone. Of course, always being as subtle as possible. We are gonna follow the same procedure that we followed with the grass shape to make the shape tile correctly, making sure that the two nodes at each side are at the same height with the Align and Distribute dialog. So if it's not open, go to Object, Align and Distribute. Select the two corresponding nodes and click on this button to put them at the same vertical level. And repeat the same steps with the other pair of nodes below. Now let's finally introduce the curvature. Select the nodes in the middle of the path, not the outer ones, just the ones in the middle, and click on this button to transform them to smooth type. This will introduce a curvature depending on the angle of the corner. But now that we've introduced the curvature, we need to make sure it flows nicely into the next tile. So let's do the same we did with the grass, enable snapping, and duplicate everything to the side and adjust the handle so each curvature flows nicely between tiles. Remember that the end objective of each tile is that you cannot tell when one tile ends and the next one begins. After you adjust one side, you have to adjust the other one. So duplicate it to the other side and repeat the same steps. Okay, what I want to do with these shapes is to give the illusion of indented and raised planes. For this we're going to be using the same technique we use with the platform. We're going to create a little plane to indicate whether the plane is going in or out. So using the difference technique, that you should be super familiar by now, create a thin shape above and below each of the three wave shapes. For the two indented planes, follow the same steps that you did with the carved in question mark. Give it a shadow color for the shape above and a highlight for the shape below. For the raised plane, it is the exact opposite, a highlight above and a shadow below. Okay, now for the final step for the terrain, the details. Let's add some nice details like we did with the floating platform. First grab the ellipse tool and draw a few ellipses here and there in the empty spaces and give them the same color than the shadow. Remember that if you want more variation, you can just stack more than one ellipse together to get a slightly different shape. Another thing you can do to create even more variation is to do the same thing we did with the item and add shapes to the shadow area to imply some irregularities in the terrain. Adding a few spikes and a few polygons will go a long way to make the terrain feel more organic. Remember to sample the color from where you are adding the detail. It will also be a good idea to join these details with a union. For the final step, I like to add a few rocks just like we did with the floating platform. So draw a few small rocks here and there in the empty spaces. What you want to do basically is to fill the empty space, but without making it too busy that's distracting. If an area is too detailed, it may look good on its own, but it may not look that great when there are a ton of tiles all together. Here's a tiny detail I like to do. I like to create yet another polygon shape just below the rocks to make them contrast a bit more. So draw the polygons with the pen tool and send them below the rocks. The last step should be to try it with the grass shape and see if they work together. Remember that this terrain is also acting as the lower part of the upper tile with the grass, so you should see if it works with the grass on. If they don't, you can always grab the pen tool and make some adjustments, maybe moving these planes a bit up or down, or moving some details around. When we created the grass outline, the stroke was leaving a bit the silhouette, so here I just corrected that using the group snapping method to snap the grass to the corner of the tile, placing it entirely inside of it. Now the tile really has the exact shape of the square and it's perfectly tileable. Okay, we are done with the upper grass terrain tile and the middle terrain tile, but we still need the two end tiles that will make the floor and platforms look way nicer. So let's do that in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're gonna finish with the terrain by creating the tiles that are gonna go to the side. We need two of these tiles, one to end the upper terrain tile, the one with grass, and another to end the lower pure terrain tile. If you want, you can create another two for the other side, but the most common thing is that you just flip them horizontally if you need. So we're gonna be making only two tiles. First of all, we need the finished tiles as a guide. I grouped them so they won't cause any problems at the moment of drawing. A curious thing about these side tiles is that they won't gonna occupy one entire square, only about less than half of one. It's a purely decorative tile. Without it, a platform or floor would look unfinished. So what we're gonna try to do is something similar to the end section of the floating platform we made previously. Okay, let's start with the grass again. Just follow the same steps you followed to create the grass in the last lesson. Only that this time try to define a nice looking ending silhouette for the grass. Also remember to not overextend, with 3 or 4 ellipses that reach to about half a tile is just fine. Join them with a union. Notice how the shape overextends a bit to the tile right next to it. We'll need to cut out the excess, so grab a rectangle and snap it to the tile. Use this shape to intersect the outline so it fits perfectly within the tile. Try to make them look nice and natural by adjusting the silhouette with the node tool. And try to make this shape fit with the end of the other grass shape, making the transition go as smooth as possible. When you're done, repeat the same step with the lower grass shape. Again, use 3 or so ellipses and make sure this grass shape won't extend past the other top grass shape. This way it looks more like a cliff. The next few steps, you should know them by heart by now. Give them the color, use the difference technique to create the shadows and highlights, adjust the shadows and highlights so they connect with the ones in the other tile, and give it the outlines. This time you are gonna have to cut the outline in the right side so it won't overlap with the other tile. Just select the nodes you want to delete and go to the button Delete Segment. and the grass section of the tile is done. Try it out to see if it fits with the grass in the other tiles. Okay, now it's time for the terrain section. Remember, this area is meant to give a nice ending to the platform, so we are going to be doing something similar to what we did with the edges of the floating platform. We're going to create a side plane, but there is a tiny little issue we have to have in mind. Remember that we used the same terrain tile to create the tile with grass and the tile with only terrain. Well, we won't do that now, mainly because this won't look good. We want the extra variation in the silhouette at the edges, so we'll need to make two tiles, one that connects the patches of grass and the other one that continues with the shape. So let's begin with the upper tile, the one with the grass. This one is simple. With the pen tool, just make these irregular straight lines to imply some broken terrain. I prefer to give it a bit of a slope and leave some grass hanging to the side to make it look more like a cliff. Here I recommend you to just move on as if you were making a single 2-tile long shape. Don't mind where the first and second tile start. We're gonna cut this shape into two neatly separated tiles in a moment. Now let's separate this shape into two tiles. Grab the rectangle tool and make sure that there is no smoothing in the corners. And with the grid snapping enabled, create two rectangles that fit perfectly the squares, one on each tile, and send it below the L shape. Duplicate the L shape and intersect it with one of these rectangles. With the leftover shape, intersect it inside the other rectangle. And there you go. You have two different L shapes that fit perfectly within a tile square. By doing this, we are skipping over a ton of headaches with snapping shapes so they fit and tile correctly. As far as the details, well, of course, the first thing we should do is to continue with the wavy shapes. This is easy, just enable snapping with the grid snapping disabled, and with the pen tool snap to one of the corners of the shape and finish it off. I'm just using a single shape here, cause this shape is really simple, so I leave the silhouette and finish it off in one go. Try to make the waves transition in a smooth way, and repeat the same steps for all the three waves. When you're done, intersect them inside and give it the colors. The next step is making the shadows and highlights. You just made all these in the previous lesson. The quickest way to do them is to use the difference technique. Eyeball the height so it fits with the other highlights or shadow. I didn't notice that this outline also leaves the tile, so I'm repeating the same steps I did with the other outline to keep it inside of the tile. And one final detail. I want to do the same we did with the floating platform and create some sort of outer plane to accentuate the border. So with the pen tool, create this thin shape that roughly follows the silhouette of the contour all the way down. Again, make it continue to the next tile as if it were a single shape. When the moment to intersect the shape in comes, the only thing you'll need to do is to create an extra copy before intersected in each tile. And the end result should be that you have two shapes that fit exactly in the area they should be. Give this shape the dark brown color with a very low alpha that we use as a shadow color in the floating platform. And now for the last little detail, enable snapping and start creating these planes on all the areas where they should be pointing down. When you're done, give it the same low alpha dark brown color. And because the stacking of the two alpha values, this should read as being even darker. If you have any problem, adjust the alpha a bit more. And we are done with the tiles. With these four shapes, you should be able to create any type of platform with any dimensions. Of course, there are a lot of possible things you can do here. For example, with what you know now, it shouldn't be too hard to create things like holes in the terrain, more elaborated platform endings, or even diagonal or sloped tiles. In fact, any of these will be a really nice homework. We really just scratched the surface, but now you have the knowledge to experiment and try new things. And that's exactly what I recommend you to do now.